So the Gospel of John. Here's the big idea for this morning. The Gospel of John, the big idea is this. The Gospel of John is primarily not trying to give us information. It's inviting us into a relationship. It's inviting us into a decision and a way to see reality. Here's the challenge. Some of us come to the Scriptures and we approach it like any other textbook or website, and we are just gathering information. And we go to Bible studies this way. We will go, I just need more information. Because there's a lie that if we have more information, then God will accept me. I'll be better. There's something I don't know. And there might be something you don't know. But when you actually start to pause and wrestle and work through and listen to the voice of Jesus, He taught in a way that says, now there's something to do. So He gives us the tools and says, obey, follow me, live it out. And so, yes, Jesus says, come all who are weary, come as you are, but He's not going to leave you as you are. There is an expectation of change that He is going to call us to. And so this isn't about, as we begin to walk through the Gospel of John this year, this isn't about increasing our knowledge. I'm sure you're going to get information you didn't know. I already have some that I am learning along the way. But what do you do with that? That's the bigger question. And what John is going to do is he's going to invite us into a relationship. He's going to take us to this moment of make a decision. If this is true about Jesus, how does that impact your life? If it doesn't impact your life, why are we here? If Jesus didn't raise from the dead, we're a bunch of fools, Paul says. And John knows this. But he also has a unique way of sharing the message of Jesus. And part of that is to challenge how we see reality, how we see ourselves and the world around us. So here's the first. So there's a couple, some might say, academic questions we're going to walk through. I think it's important to know. For example, here's the first question. Who wrote the Gospel of John? Why is this important to know? Because it roots it in history. These events took place. We can go to the places it took place. We can literally trace some of the history and see how it interacted. Is it true? So, when we start to ask the question, who wrote the Gospel of John, we look first internally. What did the book say about itself? And so as we look internally, it doesn't say, today when we write a letter, we would put at the end of the letter, Paul does this in a few of his letters, but from John, from Matthew, from whoever. If they're really close, love. If it's my mom, there's probably X's and O's that are on there. Now some of you are I don't even write letters anymore. Well, think about email, okay? But there's a personal side, and some of these letters in the New Testament, they don't tell us. There's assumptions made. And so John doesn't tell us directly who wrote the gospel, but the internal evidence refers to whoever wrote this clearly was an eyewitness to some stuff. There are conversations. Well, how did he know that? He writes in a way that whoever writes it, and I'll get to that in a moment, they wwere there. There's also a term that you'll find throughout the text that says the disciple who Jesus loved. Doesn't describe the name. Give us the name. That's who we are. But it uses this term, the disciple whom Jesus loved. And it assumes that people know who that is. So there's a little bit of problem because of distance historically. But this is the one who wrote the text. When you get to the end of the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verse 21, there's an interesting conversation. I'm not going to give all the conversation, but Jesus is having a conversation with Peter. And Peter is this type of guy that asks lots of questions. He asks the awkward questions. Sometimes he puts his foot in his mouth, and it gets weird in the conversation. And so there's a serious conversation between Jesus and Peter. And in chapter 20, he goes, 21, sorry, he turns to Jesus and goes, because Jesus tells Peter about his death, a little bit around that. And so Peter's like, well, what about that guy over there? And it's John that he refers to. And then John writes these words in chapter 21. You can read it for yourself. John chapter 21, verse 24. This disciple. So when Peter goes, what about that disciple over there? This disciple that Peter was pointing to, who's John the Apostle, testifies to these events that are recorded and recorded here. And we know that these accounts of these things are accurate. So there's a little bit of like, it's probably him, it's probably John the Apostle. And so, not directly listed, but that seems what would be internal. And there's a couple of things you can go through. We won't have time. But that's the first thing we look at. Here's the second thing we look at, which is the traditional view, that it's John the Apostle. So, how do we know some of these? Traditionally, we have said this is, you read the listings of the apostles, it would say John, son of Zebedee. This is one of the first 12. Jesus called a bunch of people, but then he selected 12 leaders amongst them. Because that scripture said he spent a night doing it, of praying, Lord, show me who. And John, son of Zebedee, was one of the guys that he pulls out. He was one of the original 12. Not only that, John the Apostle was part of the inner circle. By the way, great example of how to do church. Large group, then you have the 12, smaller, then in the 12, there's 4. Jesus, Peter, James, and John. We need all of those in our lives at different seasons. Very important. So John had an inside walk with Christ, deeper than some of the other disciples. I'm sure that caused a little bit of friction at times, right? Because we get jealous. But it was there. And so because of this, there's early support in the early church. One of the questions we ask, okay, how did the first receivers of this letter handle this letter? Who did they think it was from? How did the first people in the first 100 years deal with this letter? And what we see is in the writings of the early church is that they supported that John the Apostle. And so that's where we would start to fall in line as well. And we see like some of the church fathers start to talk about this. There's a great little thing that I'll call the chain of testimony. This is pretty cool. The chain of testimony. So, picture John the Apostle. I have no idea what he looked like, but picture him standing right here. John the Apostle, like we are praying for these names up on the wall, he discipled an individual named Polycarp. I just need to make sure I get the order right. So John discipled a guy named Polycarp. So Polycarp would technically be like the first generation of discipleship. So there was Jesus, John, Polycarp, and then another gentleman, church father, named Irenaeus. And that guy talks about the relationship with Polycarp, who knew John, and says, oh yeah, John totally wrote that letter. That letter came from John. Some of those church fathers that end guy is in, like, if we had nothing from the New Testament, we could probably rewrite the New Testament based on their writings. Because they wrote so much about the New Testament. They were the leaders and the teachers. We know them as the church fathers historically. They're the first leaders amongst the church after the disciples. There's a relational chain. And so we can go back to that and go, okay, this increases the evidence that it was John the Apostle. Why is this important? Because it roots it in history. It's not some magical thing that comes down from heaven that only one person knows about. There's a group. There are literally people alive who can go, John, that didn't happen. I was also there, John. I know what was going on. And so this letter from this idea that John wrote these letters was right from the beginning. And by the 2nd century, it was pretty much unanimous that John wrote this letter. Now, scholarship would continue to move forward, and so as you look at modern scholarship, they would start to ask a couple of questions. They would say, let's just pause for a moment. This area of scholarship is known as internal criticism. Don't get hung up on the word criticism. It's just evaluating what's going on. And so they would look at stuff and go, wait a minute, how could a fisherman write so good? John was just an average dude. How could somebody know the inner conversations of Pilate or some of these other scenes with Nicodemus? Or some of the writing, they don't think John was that good. And so they start to add other names. And so some of the other names that they think somewhat would suggest Lazarus. Remember, Lazarus died. Jesus comes, rises from him from the dead, plays an important role in the early church. And so some attribute the letter to him. This is also modern day. This is not like when it was first written. Some attribute, they think, they don't have a name, but they think there was a disciple who had a higher social status, who knew how to write better and was able to get some of the inner circle. And so those conversations take place in the midst of this conversation of who wrote the Gospel of John. But what I would say is, I want to go back to those who were closest when that letter first came out. And I think there's higher evidence to that. And I think God can take somebody who is a lonely fisherman and maybe, we think lowly of, and do incredible things. And I think that's what happened with John. Is God transformed a community. And so I'm okay to say John wrote that. I want to say this. Whether you are a full believer, someone on the journey, or a total skeptic, the scriptures never ask us to let go of our thinking, to throw our brains out. And so we need to think through this. We need to ask the tough questions. And I think as you walk that journey, I was reading, for some reason it came up, maybe because I've been reading all week, came up on one of my feeds about, there's a manuscript, a section of a manuscript, so it's not like this big, it's like this big. But it has portions of the Gospel of John that are less than 50 years from the original, probably what is the original copy. That's utterly incredible for ancient documents. There's nothing like it. And so I think there's some ability to trust that John was the author. So when was this book written? Generally speaking, the book was written somewhere around 80 and 90 AD. Remember, Jesus probably died around 33, 34, somewhere in there. Depending how you calculate, he probably died there, so less than 50 years. We have the New Testament starting to be written, if not finished. And it's written, some think that John just waited a little longer. Well, he was tied up in prison for a little while, but he becomes this leader in the city of Ephesus. I'll talk about that in a second. And so it's pushed somewhere in 80, 90. There is a scholarly, for those who are interested, there is a conversation of maybe most of the New Testament was actually written quite a lot earlier, because there is no conversation about the destruction of the temple. And something that big most likely would have been written. And if that's true, I don't know. This is again getting above my pay grade. But if that's true, what it means is that these letters were written before 70 AD, because we know the temple was destroyed around 70 AD. By the way, this just adds credibility to it if it's written earlier. All the New Testament was written before 100 AD, which is incredible historically as well. Again, this is important because it roots it in history. And this is important. We can go to the places that it talked about. John did mess up some of the places. He got, and that adds some flavor to the conversation about this gospel. So who was John the Apostle? Again, I'm only going to give us a couple highlights here this morning, but just I want us to help us understand. John the Apostle, I already said, was an average fisherman, and he was quick-tempered. Anybody can relate to that? I won't ask you to put your hand up, but maybe you got some quick temper. Jesus called John and his brother, he said, "You're the sons of thunder." They were passionate. They I kind of put them maybe at moments in their youth a little reckless. They jumped into things really quick. They were businessmen. Their family had a fishing business. They did it together. When you read the New Testament, they literally like Jesus, like, "Hey, come with me." And so they drop their nets and they go away, and their poor dad is stuck to clean everything up. Eventually, that family comes to faith and becomes part of the circle. John, though in the midst of his passion and recklessness at moments, here's what I want us to hear is Jesus didn't push him away. You know what Jesus does? Come. Walk with me. And this This man who becomes part of the inner circle of Jesus. He was, if you know the scriptures, he was at the transfiguration. There's another moment he was at, this moment where just a couple of the disciples were up in a room and somebody was healed. He got to see parts of the glory of Christ, but he also knew the cost of obedience. He called himself the disciple whom Jesus loved, but this wasn't a pride thing. It was because he understood that his deepest identity wasn't in his work. It was in the reality that God loved him. He was a child of God. And this drove him to write his letter. At the cross, if you remember the gospel story, when Jesus is getting nailed on the cross, all the disciples run away, but John is standing there at the cross with Mary. And Jesus turns to John and says, take care of my mother. There's an intimacy there that's going on. There's a trust that happens. John had the privilege to see these things. But there's another moment in John's life where he's exiled to an island. Christians were persecuted, still are today around the world. John was exiled to this island. Looked like everybody had left him, and what happens is God reveals his plans. We have the book of Revelation that is delivered, that John writes through these visions that are given on this island, and becomes what we know as the book of Revelation. It's at the end of our Bible. It wasn't one of the last ones. It's just because it talks about end things. So we put it at the end. And John is on that island. God is not silent in the midst of the island. So maybe you find yourself on an island this morning in a season of loss, in a season of like, I don't get it. God will speak. Keep looking. Keep searching. Then there's some government changes, and John's allowed to leave the island, and he becomes a leader in the city of Ephesus, kind of the surrounding communities, and he becomes this patriarch in a sense, continuing to raise up leaders and make disciples and encourage and shepherd and write. 1 John and 2 John and 3 John are small letters in the New Testament he also wrote on top of the gospel and the book of Revelation. Here's a little tidbit, little disciple fact. John was the only disciple who we believe died of natural causes. He wasn't crucified. Most of the others were like severely tortured. He had his suffering moments, but we believe he died of natural causes as he faithfully served the church in Ephesus. God took this man who was what might be, some would say, reckless, to write these words of God is love. Love your neighbor. There's a compassion in the midst of his writing. One of the things that you will see as you read the Gospel of John slows down. Let's talk about the uniqueness of John's Gospel. There are 4 Gospels in the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are known as the synoptic Gospels. It means seeing together. There's lots of parallels between them. And then you get to John, and like 90%, there are no verbal parallels to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's unique. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, especially the Gospel of Mark, are very fast. They share short stories, smaller teachings. And then you get to John. Let's just sit here for a moment. And just be still. And you have long conversations. You know, a huge chunk of the end of the Gospel of John is just the final week of Jesus. And the crucifixion and Passover and conversations in the midst of the disciples that are taking place. Oh, John also, he doesn't start with the manger. We just came through Christmas, talked about the manger, the birth of Christ. John doesn't start there. What does John do? In the beginning. Sounds like an epic movie about to start. Why does he start there? Well, as you read his gospel, you learn that he's concerned about, if Jesus is who he said he is and did what he did, what's that mean in our life? And he's worried about meaning and identity and perspective, reality. How does the teaching of Jesus affect all of those things? If Jesus really matters, I want to hear from a witness who has wrestled through these truths of what it meant. And John does that. Something unique about John is signs. All the other Gospels, John as well, they talk about miracles. You see it throughout the Gospel. Lots of miracles. But John doesn't have as many miracles as the other Gospels. And John calls his miracles signs. And you actually do see this in the other Gospels, but John ups the ante a little bit. John says this miracle took place to show this. It's a sign that points to something. So it has something to deal with in the moment, healing, restoring, that takes place, but it's about something bigger. And this is what he's going to call us to. And what he does is he just doesn't go, yeah, God healed this person, and then this person, and this person. No. He sits, God healed this one, and we hear conversations that are taking place. And so here's a question that I had written down, is what if the miracles are not the point? Some of us chase miracles. But what if the miracles aren't the point? The point is what they're pointing to. What is God trying to get your attention? So when I was first, one time I was young, and I was in Belgium, and I was lost. I had to go from point A to point B. There was no English, and I had to get on a train. And one took me one way, and one took me the wrong way. And I remember praying, Lord, I was with someone else, so we prayed, Lord, we don't know what to do. We need to get to this place. Because we had to be at a location. There was some more training as we went to share the gospel and support the church there. This is weird. I'm just going to warn you. It's as if the crowd just opened up. There's an old man who comes forward and literally goes, get on that train. And then I swear he disappeared. Told you it was weird. But there was a miracle for me in that moment, because the guys was like, what just happened? So we're like, okay, let's get on the train. See where it goes. And we learned to trust the Lord, to guide us, and to lead us. And so we got to the right place. Here's a couple another uniqueness about the Gospel of John. He has these I am statements. He says, I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection. And these all, by the way, these statements is what got him killed. But they go back to the book of Exodus, which was read. Anna read some of the Exodus this morning. They go back to that book of Exodus when God reveals himself to the people as they're coming out of Egypt. He says, give us a name, I am. And Jesus says, the same God that delivered, by him taking on these titles, the same God that delivered Israel out of Egypt is standing before them. We've got to have a conversation about that, Jesus. Don't just pass that by. If it's true, if these statements are true, I am the bread of life, I am the light of the world, I am the good shepherd, there are implications in our life. And John invites us just to sit with that. They echo the revelation of the days in the past. Here's another uniqueness, I've already touched on it, so I'll go quickly, is the long conversations and not short sayings. We have, John chapter 17, most of that, it's a prayer. We hear Jesus' prayer. There's these long conversations that take place, extended. Nicodemus is another one. The Samaritan woman, John chapter 4, Pilate. And here's something incredible we see in these conversations. Everybody misunderstood Jesus. So we're in good company. Because he's not expecting us to get it all. He's actually inviting us to ask questions. To come with our confusion and our questions. They don't disqualify us. I think they're expected. It's okay. So we need to be a group that doesn't get angry when somebody asks a question. It goes, I don't think that's true. Well, why did they say that? And wrestles with it. We need that. We need space for that. We need to allow it. We need to allow people to wrestle with these questions. So why did John write? Why did he write his gospel? John chapter 20, verse 30 to 31 says this. John chapter 20, verse 30 to 31. The disciples saw Jesus do many other miracles. Notice there's that little he doesn't say, I saw the disciple. The disciples saw Jesus do many other miraculous signs in addition to the ones recorded in this book. Verse 31 of chapter 20. But these are written, here's his purpose, These are written that you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and by believing in him, you will have the life by the power of his name. And so, folks, the Gospel of John isn't about giving us information. It's inviting us into a relationship, into a decision, into a way of seeing reality. He writes because he believes our life is better with Jesus. And he doesn't hide that agenda. He's subtle. What he does is, you'll see it in the beginning of the gospel, is he says, come and see. Or he asks this question. We laugh at this one. Jesus meets a guy who is clearly sick. You want to be healed? Of course he wants to be healed. That's what we all think. But is that really what he wants? Jesus takes this moment of asking questions. He does the same thing to us. What do you want? Do you really want that? Do you really need that? Or maybe today he's saying, come and see. Who do you say I am? He's inviting us. Now, belief in the Gospel of John is not blind faith. Sometimes when we talk about faith, we think it's blind faith. It's not blind faith. It's based on true encounters with the living God. And John writes out of that. He shares some of those stories. I want to just share a resource. I think it's on the next slide. There's a podcast. If you're into podcasts, if you're not, just pause for a moment. This couple had a podcast for decades called Almost Heretical. It was one of those podcasts I wouldn't always share with people in the church because pastors aren't. So here's just a little secret. Pastors doubt sometimes. I don't have all the answers. And what I love about this podcast called Almost Heretical was they asked tough questions that if I kind of threw out in groups as a pastor, they'd be like, what? You can't ask that question. You're supposed to have it all figured out. But I loved what they asked questions that will push our buttons. And in the podcast, the gentleman will talk about, he went through a season of deconstruction. Of deconstructing, why does he believe that? Why does the church believe that? Why do we do that? Is that true? And talks about all the mess and gives lots of stuff in there. In December, they changed the name to Faith Lab for the podcast. And I had stopped listening, not really by choice, just life happened. And he talked in this podcast about after a long season of deconstructing the faith, it actually led him back to Christ. And so now you have this new journey of Faith Labs, which he wants to say faith, and he talks about this. He says faith, when we talk about faith, we think blind faith. But that's not the kind of faith that Jesus talks about. When John writes, it's based on evidence. It's based on encounters and truth. And he wants to, in this, as they move forward, still keep asking the deeper questions. Because there are thousands, if not millions, across our country wrestling with these questions. And so I'd encourage you to listen to it, but be willing to be pushed. And you may not agree with everything. You should listen to things you don't agree with. It pushes you. But faith is what this resource can help us with. It's what John is calling us to. I think as we come to this text, it's kind of like sitting down with a great teacher. Where we come, we want all the answers. We live in a day, we can type something in, and most of the time the answers come up. We want everything instant. But what I think John does, it's as if we come to his house, we got great questions, and he says, come with me to the kitchen. Okay, John. So we go into the kitchen. Okay, John, here's what I ask you. Yeah, just grab a seat. Okay, John, I'll sit down. Now, John, he says, hey, let's want a tea? We should have tea. And he starts gets the kettle and sets it down. Okay, John, but I got all these. Yes. And he starts to reveal a little bit, and like, oh, tea's ready, and gets up, and there's a uneasiness and anxiety for us today. And John is just saying, just slow down. We come to the text that way. You know, especially if you're new to this, you're like, and I read the whole thing. And when I listen to new people come to the text, you're like, I read like 4 books in here. I'm utterly amazed at what some people will read. And if they start at Genesis and go through, I'm like, you got through that book. That's pretty impressive. I often encourage people to start in the Gospels. But what John does is he slows down. And what I want to say is I think that's what he's going to call us to. Sit with Jesus. Don't rush your readings of Scripture. Wrestle with the deep questions. When you're in your small groups, smaller settings, one-on-one discipleships, don't rush it. Ask the tough questions. Don't be afraid to go, I don't know. Let's look at that. This is what Jesus calls us to. This is what he invites us to. He says, come to me. And he's inviting us to his presence. He's inviting us to surrender our life to him. Don't rush that. Because it is costly. You will have dreams that you will have to lay down. Your life will not get easier if you choose to follow Jesus. If you don't believe me, we could take some time. Trust me, there are people here who can give you testimony. But here's what they will say, but Jesus got me through it. They have faithful stories of encounters with Christ that John writes about as well. And he says to every single one of us, come and see. There's so much I would love to share more. But I want to just give us a moment to be in his presence. What do you believe about Jesus? We get rushing through our weeks. Some of us just don't stop and be present. We say we trust him. But when the storm comes, we try to do it. We don't start with him. There are things we have to do, but we have to start with him. I want to encourage us to invite him in. This is why we have started the year with prayer. If we are ever to reach the people on our oikos maps, we have to spend time in the presence of God because the battle is on our knees. We need to get to know this Jesus. Because we have no right to share it if we don't know him. And so this morning, the worship team is going to come and as we conclude, they're going to lead us through a song here. And I want to encourage you, just be. Just take a breath and say, Jesus, you said you are the great shepherd. I need a shepherd right now. You said this, Jesus. I need you to show up. Or maybe take a moment and pray for those names. Bring one and say, God, I need you to move. I bring this person to you. Bring freedom to their life. And if you need to come up, we don't to the front as an act of surrendering those names or those worries to the one who said, let there be light, and there was light. Then take that moment. You need to kneel where you are as part of the surrendering. Then do that. You need to stand as part of like, Lord, I am giving you all this. Then take that. We're still fresh into the new year. This is an opportunity to invite the Creator into our life because he's literally standing going, let me in. Let me guide. He's asking us to trust. He's asking us to pause and really this year get to know him. And so I want to encourage us to take that moment to do. If you want to sing along with the worship team, then as part of just pausing in this moment, then please sing. Or let others. And if you pray, some of you were here last week, so you'll remember this. Pray out loud. Don't sit there in silence and pray in your heart or your mind. Pray the words out loud. The music team's going to be playing, so probably no one will hear you anyway. but speak the words. There is power when we speak those words. And so speak them. Invite the Spirit, speak it out loud. And if there's a bunch of murmur taking place as people are praying, that's what we do. Let's pray. Let's speak these words. Let's bring our people to Jesus, our families. Pray that the glory of Christ, the kingdom of God, would be established in our homes, in our city. We've been praying that this week. I'm praying that you would encounter Christ in a fresh way. So let's bow our heads. Worship team can come.